jazz poetry. This is something that might be familiar to most of you. Poetry, it's basically, as the name indicates, it incorporates elements from jazz music, or it is about jazz music, or it is about jazz musicians, or it is about the cultural context of jazz poetry. So in some way, jazz poetry is related to jazz music. Jazz emerges from the word jasm, which means energy. So you might have listened to jazz poetry. You might have listened to jazz poetry of the African American community, as well as the jazz poetry that is emerging in other parts of the globe today. It is characterized by a kind of energy, a kind of a trance-like state where everyone is, their body is completely invigorated by this song. So jazz is basically a type of singing, as a type of song. So jazz poetry incorporated elements from jazz music. Now, the 1920s and 30s are considered as the jazz age, when jazz music and dance became popular in the US. So during this period, during the 1920s and 30s, making alcohol was declared illegal. It was a period of prohibition, and people were not allowed to make alcohol. And when they made alcohol, it was called bootlegging. Now, people who engaged in the illegal manufacturing of liquor were arrested, and people who drank liquor made thus were also subject to punishment. Now, at that time, certain establishments called speakeasies came up. Something like bars or clubs, some small establishments where they gave alcohol, they gave illegal alcohol. So in these places, people got the chance to sing and dance and express themselves, because outside it was all very strict. So a lot of people resorted to these speakeasies to articulate themselves. So the jazz music emerged from there. Now, jazz music emerged in the 1920s, basically in places like New Orleans, Louisiana, and other areas of the US. And it spread to Harlem, which is a central area where African American communities reside, and Chicago. And it was fundamentally related to the Afro American community, and was rooted in the oral tradition, which came from the African influence. So African music, the influence of African music can be seen in jazz poetry. So there are certain songs, certain genres that are associated with the African community, like blues, for instance. The blues were melodic, it carried spiritual elements. Okay, so the influence, all these blues and other popular forms of music associated with the African American community are rooted in oral tradition. And you can guess why. Why is it related to the oral tradition? Because it is derived from African folk songs and African music and African dance and African literature, or African art forms were mostly folk art forms, which were transmitted by word of mouth. And the oral tradition was very significant in Africa. And as such, these kind of things made their presence felt in jazz music. Jazz music was also predominantly oral. It was rarely written down. Okay, people performed without any writing. Now, what are some of the important features of jazz poetry? First thing was improvisation. Okay, they improvised on existing types of writing. Okay, it was a break from earlier types of writing, and it also built upon and made new some of the existing ways of writing and existing ways of singing. And they retained African rhythms in their works. Okay, so jazz music incorporates elements from African literature, African folk music, and it's very rhythmic. African folk music is quite rhythmic, just like the folk songs that can be found in India. And these rhythms found their way into jazz poetry. And syncopation, okay, this is called syncopation. In syncopation, there's a sudden break to create a rhythm. So the song is moving peacefully, and then suddenly there's an abrupt halt. And that creates a rhythm. The halt comes at regular intervals, creating a certain rhythm. Okay, so this syncopation that can be found in African folk music made its presence felt in jazz music and in jazz poetry. and the musician came to be more important than the composer. In jazz music, there might have been someone who's created the song, but it was a musician who articulated it through music and dance who became prominent. And African folk songs follow a call and response pattern, as in there's someone calling out to a character and the character responds with a line. Then again, the other character calls out to someone or asks a question and there's a response. So African folk songs move along these lines where there are calls and responses. Okay, you can find this in Indian folk music also. Now, these were mainly field songs, songs that were sung by the tribal community while they were in the farms. Okay, so you can see the influence of these kinds of songs and African rhythms in poetry of the jazz period, of jazz poetry. And African folk music was greatly informed by spirituality. Like, for instance, if you take blues, which emerged from African folk songs, you can see liturgical elements. You can see um, elements of spirituality, and there's an excessive emphasis given to Christianity. So all these, and there were hymns, there were a lot of Christian hymns that were sung in Africa. All these made their way into America and into jazz music and into jazz poetry. There were later types where bebop, as the name indicates, it emerged in the 1940s. Bebop indicates a sudden stop, right? Bebop. Okay, it indicates a sudden stop. The music like that, where there are sudden halts, there are sudden syncopations that emerge. These are all considered part of jazz poetry. Then there is Afro-Cuban jazz, incorporating elements from African music and Cuban music. Now, modal jazz, hard bop, free jazz, and Latin jazz, liturgical jazz. Okay, this is again drawn. All these are drawn from African field songs and folk music. And there is psychedelic jazz. This you might be aware of the drug culture and the beat generation of poets who were deeply influenced by the drug culture in America. So it is something similar, psychedelic jazz, which it has some relation to drugs and singing in under the influence of drugs and especially psychedelic drugs. Now there is acid jazz, there is new jazz, there is jazz rap, punk jazz incorporating elements of jazz music and punk music. So all these emerged. If you look at the time period, it emerged in the 1940s, 50s, and lasted in the 80s. Even today, jazz music is very prominent. It mainly flourished during the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, jazz poetry emerged and flourished during the Harlem Renaissance and later influenced the beat generation. So the beat generation led by Allen Ginsberg also paid a lot of attention to rhythms, and hard music and pop music. All these arose from jazz music, and you can see the influence of African folk songs and field songs in jazz poetry. Now, there's a strong oral element and improvisation, syncopation, and the use of free words in jazz poetry. And the sentences and phrases are very casual and they are very short. And because there are sudden abrupt halts, the rhythm looks very bouncy. It looks like it is jumping, that is why people dance to jazz music. And that is one of the reasons why jazz music attained a lot of prominence among the youngsters of the period, and even led to the emergence of jazz subcultures or youth subcultures that paid a lot of importance to jazz music and pop music and punk music. Now, there's a spontaneity to jazz music and jazz poetry. If you look at the situation in India, the folk songs, they're not written down. They're not composed beforehand. People sing it out of the blue, like they already know the language and they create songs out of it. The same thing applies to jazz music and jazz poetry. And they also use a colloquial language. They did not resort to high English, rather they used the English of the African American people, where the usage is like ain't I, ain't it, so I are. Okay, so these kind of so-called erroneous English, which the African community appropriated. Okay, that can be seen in jazz music. And the meter keeps on changing quickly. Sometimes there's no meter, and when there is meter, there is no rigid pattern to this meter. And another important feature of oral folk poetry is repetition. The lines are repeated. Okay, so this again is another feature that you see in jazz poetry. There are refrains, there are lines that are constantly repeated. Now, the major poets, you might be familiar with most of them: Langston Hughes, Emery Baraka, Marvin Bell, Michael Harper, Mina Loy, Hayden Carroll, and so on. There are innumerable number of poets of the jazz period. There are people who wrote extensively in the format of jazz poetry. So I'll just show a very important, a very useful example of jazz poetry, The Weary Blues by Langston Hughes. It's available in YouTube. We'll just take a minute to listen to it. My net is a little slow, so it might take a bit of time. And so if you look on the right side, you can see a number of examples of jazz poetry. And remember, jazz poetry was not just written, it was sung, as the Weary Blues and Harlem Night and Minstrel Man and Exits. All these are sung also. They are not just written. Please try to listen to whether there are repetitions, and try to listen to the rhythm and see where syncopation occurs, and where there are rhythms, and if you can locate any African music there. Now can you see the slides?
Yes.
Yes. So if we look at this song, I hope you have listened to the rhythm, the music that accompanies this song. So it is, if you look at the singer. Okay, sorry, I'll start my video. If you look at the singer, you can see his body movements also. So it's not like he's just standing there and singing. He's appealing to the audience to respond in some way, and it is like like a folk song where there is a response that is being expected. So in the Weary Blues, we can see a lot of repetition. Maybe you might not be able to listen to it in the first, if you listen to the song for the first time, maybe you can listen to it later and then try to catch the lines. So there's a repetition of, oh sweet blues, oh weary blues. So the word blues is constantly repeated. And then a poor man singing, ain't it a poor man singing. So the African language, the African American community's way of appropriating the English language, the Afro-American ethics, or the Afro-American style that can be seen here, it's all visible in this poem, The Weary Blues. Now, there's also this repetition of the line, I got the weary blues. And there are syncopations, there are sudden halts, and it creates a rhythm. There is a clear rhythm to this poem, unlike the other poems where you can recite them. Here you can only sing this poem. So you see a number of features, and there's improvisation of the language. Like I said, they don't use the so-called standard English. They use the colloquial usages and the African American community's way of using English. Then there are repetitions of lines that indicate movement. Okay, like he did a lazy sway. He did a lazy sway. So when he says it and moves his body, we get this image of movement. Okay, so it is a kind of song or poem that propels the audience to respond in some way, and it's very clear from his body language that he expects it also. In fact, in the very first line, there is a word that indicates one feature of jazz poetry. It says, drawing a drowsy syncopated tune, where there's a sudden halt and rhythm. This very poem is syncopated. In that way, the poem is also self-reflexive. Probably the singer is singing about singing the same poem. So the features of postmodernism are visible here as well. So if you can listen to the other poems also, in YouTube, it will be wonderful. And if you can try to read the lyrics and then listen to it and listen to the rhythms, you will be able to appreciate